Namaste. We bring to you a very interesting topic, namely gold in Arthashastra. I request all the Atharva Forum viewers to subscribe to the YouTube channel and press the notification so that you are informed on time. Arthashastra is a very famous, oft quoted, well researched text from our ancient past. It's an encyclopedic text and it stands as a testimony to this wonderful Subhashita from our ancient past, which goes like this. Viditvam cha nripatvam cha naiva tulyam kadachana swadeshe pujyate raja vidwan sarvatra pujyate. As the meaning implies that the intellect of an intellectual can never be equated with the kingship of a king. Whereas a king is praised or is known within his kingdom, an intellectual is sought after everywhere. And nothing better than Arthashastra comes to my mind as an example, as a testimony to this Subhashita. And why do I say this? Is because of the anecdote that is associated with this very manuscript when it was rediscovered by Dr. R Shamasastry at the Mysore Oriental Manuscript Library. So it was in the year 1905 that this manuscript was for the first time discovered by Dr. R Shamasastry, and he had from the manuscript he had brought out the critical edition, and within few years he had also brought out the English translation of it. Much later, in the 30s, when the Mysore Maharaja had a visit to London, he was introduced to the people there as somebody who has come from the city of Mysore. Prompt came a reply or a question from the audience that is it the same city where Shamasastry had discovered the Arthashastra manuscript? So when the Mysore Raja returns, he narrates this anecdote and felicitates Shamasastry also and says that whereas here I am known as a king, when I go abroad, I am known as belonging to that city where you have discovered this Arthashastra manuscript. So that's why I said this Arthashastra itself is like an example to this adage, Swadeshe Pujyate Raja Vidwan Sarvatra Pujyate. Now, the text of Arthashastra, it's an encyclopedic text, and often it is reckoned as a text for political science or economics or something to do with diplomacy, how a king should rule. By and large, it is true that this text concerns even these aspects also, but I would like to draw the attention to our listeners that Arthashastra is an encyclopedic text. The dating of it is again debatable, like any other prominent text of our country. The error bars in the dating goes up to few hundreds of years, but the most accepted date, which is also debatable, is around the 300 before the Common Era. And that was a period, if you look from that era till Varahamihira's Brihat Samhita, we can see that there is the style of writing has been like encyclopedic, where all the topics under the sun were covered. Unlike the Brihat Samhita, where you really have all the topics covered under the sun, Arthashastra is slightly more specialized. Nevertheless, it also has got a spectra of topics within its fold. Now, there have been researchers who have tried to equate or compare and analyze Arthashastra with the another very prominent Indian text in Tamil, which is called the Thirrukural. And without getting into the details of these analysis, it would suffice for me to highlight the kind of comparison and the contrast which has happened through just one example. Now, the authorship of Arthashastra is Vishnugupta or Chanakya or Kautilya. And there have been again debates in the academic domain as to whether these three people were one and the same, or even any one of them were really the authors of this text called Arthashastra. It has been categorically proved that these three were one and the same, because as per the tradition in India, most of the people will have more than one names, and in many times the Gotra name is also get associated. So these three were indeed are at least accepted by a large school of intellectuals today, that these three were one, namely Vishnugupta, Chanakya, and Kautilya, and that he was the author of this text called Arthashastra. Now, whether we really have the entire compendium of Arthashastra, that's something which is a question mark, because although another interesting feature of this text is that it follows the style of the Tantrayukti. Now, there is one other text which clearly delineates the style of this kind of writing, is the Charaka Samhita, and by Tantra Yukti, it elucidates 36 methods of writing. In one of our previous Atharva Forum videos, you must have listened to Dr. Maheshwaran, who elucidated different methods or different tools, techniques to get into a debate. If that is an oral counterpart, we had such prescriptions for even how to write a technical text. So that is covered under the aegis of Tantra Yukti, which is very much invoked as one of the chapters. The 15th chapter of Arthashastra is enumerating Tantra Yukti, and similar is the trend which we find in Charaka Samhita. The contrast that I wanted to give between Thirrukural and the Arthashastra, which our social researchers have got into, is the fact that Arthashastra is a text written by quote unquote Brahmin author, whereas Thirrukural, attributed to Thiruvalluvar, is introduced to us as belonging to a community which is popularly referred to as a weaver community. So, whereas Arthashastra is seen as a very dogmatic text resorting to all sorts of exploits of human weaknesses, devoid of any morals or ethics, that is completely contrasted with this Thirukkural, where it is concerning about spiritual, moral values of human life. Now, why I'm specifically comparing it with Thirukkural is divided into three segments, namely Arattupal in Tamil, which is like Dharma, Porutpal, which is like Artha, and Kamattupal, which is like Kama. So you can see how the Chaturvida Purushartha, namely Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha, have been the bedrock, have been the underpinning for any kind of writing or intellectual disposition in our past. If Arthashastra, which by its name enumerates the Artha aspect of the Chaturvida Purushartha, where you have Dharma Shastra by Manu and other Dharma Shastrakaras, you had Kama Shastra by Vatsyayana, you have now Artha Shastra by Vishnugupta or Kautilya. So here Artha is coming in that aspect, and similarly, if Thirukkural has to be compared, it has to be compared with the combination of this Dharma Shastra, Artha Shastra, and Kama Shastra. All these three are abridged in the Thirukkural in Arattupal, Porutpal, and Kamattupal respectively. That's the reason I'm comparing that Porutpal to this Arthashastra, and it's not just me who is comparing for the first time. We have, as I said, the social researchers who have done it in the past, but they have done it with this kind of a background, that a Brahmin author versus a non-Brahmin author, and hence the kind of dealings that Arthashastra has, and the kind of dealing that the Porutpal of Thirukkural has. So that aside, specifically, as I said, Arthashastra is an encyclopedic work divided into 15 chapters. It is basically talking about how to protect a kingdom. What all steps should the king of a kingdom take, or for that matter, his advisors, the ministers, should take in order to protect the interest of the kingdom. So, in some aspect, economists as well as social scientists have looked upon it and said that because this text lays a lot of stress on state controlled mechanisms, they have looked at it as a progenitor of a socialist document. I mean, this topic today that I've taken up is not into all these details, but these are just some of the introductory remarks that I wish to give about this text and the way it has been handled by various social scientists, particularly. From the science point of view, there are very interesting aspects of scientific uh, principles, scientific information, which are also laden in Arthashastra. Specifically, we have information on metallurgy as well as medicinal science. And both of them have had distinct past. Their antiquity is well into the Vedic periods, both the metallurgy as well as the medicinal science, covered again in various other Atharva Forum talks in the past. Specifically, when it comes to metallurgy, today we will be sharing with you some of the snippets about how the metal gold is handled by Vishnugupta in his Arthashastra. Now, the gold, when I'm drawing parallel with the Thirrukural, I am again inspired to make once more the comparison with the same text, Thirrukural, and the Tamil text which existed before that, Sangam literature. And we see that there are four names attributed to gold which can be obtained from the Sangam literature, which are Atakam, Sembon, Kilichirai, and Navalam. Now, in Arthashastra, if you see, the, the discussion about the gold comes in the second Adhikarana. There are 15 Adhikarana, and each Adhikarana has got its own subsections. So, in one of the subsections of the second Adhikarana, the discussion on metals like gold, silver, copper, these occur. Predominantly, it is the gold which is being discussed here. And how Kautilya introduces it. Jambunadam, Shatakumbham, Hatakam, Vainavam, Shringashuktijam, Jatarupam, Rasa Viddhama Karodgatam, Cha Suvarnam. There are around 8 varieties of gold that Kautilya introduces, of which the 4 names that I told in Tamil, namely Adagam, Sembon, Kilichirai, and Navalam, you can see that Navalam is Jambunadam, Atakam is Hatakam, Kilichirai will come a little bit later because exact word is what is being used in Arthashastra also for referring to one form of gold. And Sembon is actually Suvarna. So you can see here, I am again and again deliberately making this distant comparison with the Tamil text for a particular reason to highlight the oneness, the unifying factor, the intellectual thread which was binding the entire country in the distant past as well. So, as I said, this is the way Arthashastra introduces the 8 golds. And then it goes about to say in what forms are they found, what are their ore forms. It's also very interesting to note that even the liquid form of gold is also getting mentioned in the Arthashastra text. And then it talks which ore is better, gold obtained from which form is better. Kautilya includes a lot of discussion about gold in his text, where he is talking basically about the safety or preserving a kingdom. When it comes to gold, it is obviously a very precious metal. It has to be processed, so it requires technology and it requires specialization. And for that matter, for making different ornaments out of gold, Arthashastra has got three different terms for it. Kshudraka, uh, Trishira, and one more third term. They are the three different gold ornaments where one is of solid gold, one is hollow, and one is drawing to the thread, drawing the gold into thread. Now there are Kautilya describes in the later portion of the chapter how you can embed different kind of gems, different pearls, diamonds into gold. And mind you, for each and everything, he describes what should be the purity of the gold and how that thing should be embedded in them. How the different technicalities were identified, were practiced, and the guidelines were well laid. If today you look at the Customs Act or Narcotics Act, through which the custom officers will be able to confiscate the contrabanded articles. If you look at those act, the wordings of those act, you will not just find legal terms there. You can find description of the chemistry, description of some of the biological aspect of the contrabanded items. So this is even in practice today. From that perspective, if you go back, Arthashastra could also be looked upon of a document of that type. Now, if a kingdom has to protect its interest, it has to safeguard its utmost cherished wealth, that is gold. Now, it has to control the regulation of it. It has to regulate it. It has to control the inflow and the outflow from the periphery of its kingdom. So, for all that, it should not be in a very arbitrary or in a very abstract sense. Kautilya had laid down the principles for that, and this is like a customs manual to say so. Because in the chapter of gold, he describes if you mix gold with this many parts of copper and silver, you would get 16 varieties of gold. And how to identify or how to conduct qualitative tests to differentiate between these 16 qualities. Now, if somebody from outside comes and sells certain gold item from a different place, how to detect what purity that belongs to. So these are indeed a matter of great concern when it comes to the welfare of an economic state, to keep the economy healthy. And that is one reason why Kautilya deals much deeper into this aspect of gold. And when he's dealing with that, we can cull out the metallurgy or the chemistry information from these passages. For instance, he says that gold may be obtained either pure or amalgamated with mercury or silver or alloyed with other impurities as mine gold. Kinchalka varnam mridusnigdham anadi bhrajishnu cha sreshtham raktapitakam madhyamam raktam avaram. So in a very cryptic way, he says that which is of the color of petals of lotus, ductile, glossy, incapable of making any continuous sound, anadi, is of middle quality, and that which is red is of low quality. So like that, he gives difference of the quality with which at the first the gold is encountered. At this place, I would also like to draw your attention to another interesting feature about this Arthashastra. After Shamasastri's edition and translation into English in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, later later in the time, in the Banaras Hindu University itself, one of the Hindi professors, Professor Prananath, had taken up the task for first time to translate this text into Hindi. Now, there are some discrepancies in the Hindi translation as well as the English version of Dr. Shamasastry. For instance, Skinjalka Varnam Mridus Nigdham Anadi is what is the text given. And Professor Prananath also adopts the same text, but he says, Kamal ke kesar rang ka mridu chamkila tatha ठन ठनाने wala sona. Now than thanane wala sona is how he interprets anadi, snigdham anadi. And in the English, the same thing is translated as that incapable of making any continuous sound. So you can see here, whereas the text is the same, now the English version of it and the Hindi version of it seems to have opposite meanings. And this is more so important because in the preface of the Hindi translation, Professor Prannath, he clearly says, and I quote, that हिंदी भाषांतर में इस कोश के सहारे मैं कई भूलों से बच गया जिनसे डॉक्टर श्याम शास्त्री स्थान स्थान पर फंस गए. So he gives example how Dr. Shama Shastri had got caught in some of the wrong translations. So he's claiming that the version it is error free, but this is something that we have to live with today, where the Hindi translation and the English translation of the Arthashastra text are having some of the disparities. That same series of describing the different types of gold, Kautilya goes further and says, Akarodgatam sisan vayena bhidyamanam pakapatrani kritva Gandikasu kuttayet kadali vajrakanda kalkeva nishechayet. So whose English translation given by Dr. Shama Shastri goes like mine gold, akarodgatam, which is brittle owing to its contamination with lead, shall be heated, wound round with cloth, pakapatrani kritva, and hammered on a wooden anvil. Gandikasu kuttayet. The disparity in the translation, and this is more serious because Sisa in the Sanskrit is often understood as lead. It is translated as lead, which is in chemistry we denote it as a symbol Pb or plumbum. But when it comes to the Hindi translation, this professor who has translated it for the first time from Sanskrit to Hindi, he translates it like this: जो सोना खान से निकला हो जस्ता मिलाकर उसे पत्रे पीटे जाए तथा खरल में उसको कूटा जाए. Now jasta milakar is what he says. This is categorically wrong because jasada comes from the Sanskrit word yashada, and yashada or jasada, they both refer to zinc, and sisa could never be translated as zinc. So this is one such serious disparity that I wish to point out here. From a chemistry point of view, this is quite interesting. Sisan vayena bhidyamanam pakapatrani kritva gandikastu kuttayet. Now here the Shama Shastri's English translation also has got a slight problem because it is not the contamination with lead. Now when the gold is found in the mine, it is true that it will have several other base metals as well as noble metals mixed with it in the alloy form. That brings to another interesting factor, that how gold is naturally occurring. There are different theories for it. The meteorite injection of gold in our rocks, that's where actually the gold is found in its zero oxidation state. But that quantity is very, very minuscule. The other way by which the gold is normally found is in its alloyed form or in its salt form. All these forms are very much correctly identified by Kautilya, except for this meteoritic gold, meteorite shower by which the gold has occurred. That is not being explicitly stated. Or perhaps Akarot Gatam could also be interpreted like the one which is obtained from the mines, and you could also have meteoritic gold obtained from there. But here he says, Kautilya says that Akarot Gatam Sisan Vagena Vidyamanam Pakapatrani Kritva. This is actually a step in solid state chemistry. Now, since gold is coming along with other base metals and lead, first what you do is you mix it with lead and you kind of heat it. Then metals of lower melting point would get dissolved in the lead, and later when you process this mixture which is having gold and separated metals which are absorbed in the lead, that you kind of mix it with pakapatra and then you kind of hammer it. So elsewhere the same process is also described in a very beautiful way. This gold refining As I said, this occurs in the two different stages. One is first to mix it with the lead so that the base metals are getting absorbed. And but this lead will not be in a position to absorb the other metals which are noble metals, like say for instance silver. Now if you want to or coinage metal like the copper. Now if you want to obtain gold of highest purity, you'll have to get rid of those other metals, other noble metals which are not being affected by the lead. So the second stage is to actually make gold into sheets with some additions, like here the addition is being talked about by uh, in the specific verse it is not talked about, but Saindhava and Suvarchala has to be added to that and made into thin sheets. Pakapatrani Kritva. That's how the term is being used here. And then it is being advised to beat it. Now, exactly what is happening here is a solid state reaction happening. You are making the metals, the quote unquote impure metals, namely the silver and the copper, diffuse from the copper to the it diffuse away from the copper's bulk. And that's only possible if you draw gold into very, very thin sheets. So that's why this is not a serendipitous or what do you call, it is not something hit and trial method that is being talked about. Unless this process was there within the practitioners for long time, Kautilya could not have put it in such clear terms. Okay. Now, whether Kautilya himself was a Rasagnya or not is a different kind of a debate. He was an intellect, but belonging to a different genre. For him to import the metallurgical truths in his text, he should have understood this, and that is only possible if that process was in society for a very long time, which is it is an optimized process. And even to this day, carrying out a solid state reaction is a non-trivial task. That's why we need several medium, solvent medium. That's why the reactions often take up various solvents. And but in the solvent state also, the reaction is not always going into completion. So here is one very beautiful example of a solid state chemistry happening where you are purifying gold of its noble metals by a solid state reaction. Kadali Vajrakanda Kalkeva Nishechayet. So you have to make a preparation of Kadali is banana, Vajrakanda is one kind of a mushroom. So mixing these, you'll have to start hitting that thin drawn sheet in a wooden anvil. That's what is being talked about here. Now in the same sense, he's talking about the different purities of the gold after the processing. Sreshthanam Pandushvetam cha apraptakam. Now here again there is a slight difference in the translation, whereas Dr. Shamasastry translate is as impure gold is of whitish color. That's all he says. But then apraptakam is left out by the English translation, which is captured by the Hindi translation. Tadyena apraptakam tat chaturgunena sisena shodhayet. The same. So this is another description of processing the gold. So that white gold, white raw form of the gold, which is white of the highest quality, now that is quite rare to be found, apraptakam. And if you are successful in finding it. Now in the same series of describing of different raw forms of gold, Kautilya says, Sreshthanam Pandushvetam cha apraptakam. Here I wish to make again a comparison between the English and the Hindi translation, whereas Dr. Shamasastry translates it as impure gold is of whitish color. The Hindi translation is more accurate because the apraptakam is captured in the Hindi translation. It is to denote that the white form of the ore of gold is very rare. Now, the next verse goes about describing how to process this kind of the ore. Tadyena apraptakam tat chaturgunena sisena shodhayet. The same process of that was described previously, that you add lead 4 times the quantity of the raw white gold and you shodhayet. You kind of heat it, you melt it. So this is the two-stage process that I described a few minutes back. The first stage is to dissolve all the base metals in the lead, and then once that is done, then you do the solid state reaction. But here again in the Hindi translation, you carefully notice that tat chaturgunena sisena shodhayet. Sisa again appears, which is your lead, but the Hindi translation again it is translated as jasda, which is zinc, and that is actually raw. So here, all the raw forms of gold which have been obtained, all the first step is to be melted with the lead, and the second step is to process them with adding different kind of vegetable materials, or sometimes this vajrakanda, which is a mushroom kind of a material. And then that solid state reaction is indeed a remarkable one, which I have already talked about. Now, having processed the gold in this way, Kautilya says that how to test the purity of the gold which has come out. Because, see, back today when we have, when you go to a gold shop, there will be even if it is a small shop in a roadside, in a very nondescript suburb, there is a good probability that that shop will have an X-ray machine. And when you come with a gold ornament, the gold ornament will be kept under that X-ray machine, and that X-ray machine will be able to tell what is the percentage of gold present in that ornament. Now, back in those days, I'm talking about Kautilya's period, which is 300 before the Common Era, you did not have such instrumental intervention by which you could assay the gold. Nevertheless, the assaying process is very much beautifully described in this whole text of Arthashastra. Now, why the assay process comes? The assay process comes because first the gold is not completely pure, and when you are purifying it, you are not sure that you get the 100% purity, right? So some amount of other metals are always mixed with it, and to add pure gold, which is today we call it in the carat unit, which is 24 carat, which comprises of almost 96 to 98 percentage of gold. It's actually very much ductile. It's very soft. It's the gold's other property is that it is quite ductile. So you obviously has to mix copper, zinc to it, and then reduce the purity of gold. So which is what is your 22 karat of gold, or what is referred to as the 921 or 921, which is properly commonly referred to as, where you have 92.1 percentage of 92.6 or 92.1 amount of gold, and the remaining amount of copper or silver. So here, but today, how to even know that 92% is there or 96% is there? That is through the X-ray machine. But then back then, we have Kautilya describes very beautiful qualitative methods to qualitatively assay the gold, the purified gold. And the common additives to this gold to make ornaments are copper or silver. And there again, those copper and silver have to be also in a very pure form, and then only you can mix with this gold. So you have in this Adhikarana subsection describing about how to purify copper, how to purify silver, how to test the purity of the silver, and then later how to mix it with the gold to make different kind of ornaments that I just talked about. So one such verse which I would like to highlight here, which says how to identify the purity of the gold. Jati hingulukena pushpakasisena va gomutra bhavitena digdhena agrahastena samsprishtam suvarnam shveti bhavati. Now the English translation of it goes like this: if the edge of the palm dipped in a solution, agrahastena. So agrahasta could be understood as a tip of a finger or tip of a palm. Now, tip of a finger is what is more logical, but the translator gives it as tip of palm, which is not appropriate because palm has got only one tip, which is the finger's end. Agrahastena samsprishtam. So if you dip the finger in a solution of jati hingulika. Jati hingulaka is a kind of a sulfide, a vermilion, which is a mercuric sulfide based compound, or sulfate of iron, or ferrous sulfate, pushpakasisa. Now here pushpakasisa occurs in the text, and the English translation captures it as pushpakasisa. but the Hindi translation gives it as Kasi's ka phool. Now, Kasi's ka phool is ambiguous because it could also refer to a flower. If you type it in Google Kasi's ka phool, you will get only flowers as a reference, not giving you the idea of ferrous sulfate. So that could be another source of confusion arising from the Hindi translation here. So what it says is, if you dip the edge of a finger in a solution of this vermilion or ferrous sulfate in cow's urine and touch the gold should become white in color. When so this is one of the chemical tests, we can say, still a qualitative test to identify the purity of the gold. Sa kesarah snigdho mridur bhajihi mridur bhrajishnushcha nikasharagah sreshtha. So that which is depending upon the color which you get, then the purity of the gold can be easily assessed. That's what this particular verse says. Testing the purity of the gold, Kautilya says, Shuddhasyaiko haridrasya suvarno varnakaha. Now, the background of it, this is the 15th shloka. The background before that comes the description of the touchstone, or what is referred to as kasauti in Hindi. So he says one has to make one streak of this gold on this touchstone, and then the verse goes, Tataha shulba kakunyuttara Shulbakakanyuttarapasarita achatu simantaditi shodasha varnakaha. So the Hindi translation of it goes like the following. कसौटी पर पहले उत्तम सोने की रेखा बनाकर उसके बाद दूसरे सोने की रेखा खींची जाए. शुद्धस्य को हरिद्रस्य सुवर्णो वर्णकः. उसके बाद the gold that we need to test has to be drawn. Now, the other verse, it says that कसौटी के समतल भाग पर जब सोने की लकीर खींची जाए तो वह नख से या अंगूठे से मलने पर मिट जानी चाहिए. सुवर्णम पूर्वम निष्कष्य पश्चात वर्णिकाम निकषयेत. After having drawn the gold one streak, you draw the streaks of the other gold. Samaraga lekham animnonnate deshe nikashitam parimriditam parilidham nakhantaradva gaurikenavachurnitam upadhim vidyat. So the Hindi translation says for this point is that after having drawn the streak of gold on the touchstone, if you rub it with your finger, the line should get erased. Now, interestingly, the English translation goes like this. Having first made a streak with Suvarna on a touchstone, then by the side of the streak, a streak with a piece of the gold to be compared with shall be made. Whenever a uniform streak on the even surface of a touchstone can be wiped off or swept away, or when the streak is due to sprinkling of any glittering powder by the nail or touchstone, then an attempt for deception can be inferred. So here, the text is again the common, whereas the Hindi translation says if the gold which is being drawn on the kasauti, if it gets wiped off, it is of a good quality. Whereas the English translation says if it gets wiped off, it is not of a good quality. So this is something which needs serious attention. The interesting aspect of this test is that even today, the first test that a gold jeweler would do when we take any old gold ornament to his shop is he would draw the line on the touchstone and he would compare it with some of his standard gold of 24, 22, 18 and 16 karat golds. And by then he will be adding some chemical to it and comparing what kind of the change. First he will compare the color of the strikes, and then he will add the nitric acid basically, or aqua regia, and then see what is the effect of this particular chemical added on the touchstone when the strike of the ornament gold has been made. So the practice of the testing the gold's purity using a touchstone has been in our tradition and culture at least since the time of uh, Kautilya. And it is not that Kautilya invented it, it should have been even centuries, if not millennia before Kautilya's time, for him to have seen this process and to have crystallized it in the text form in that we are discussing today. Further again, he goes that after the processing of the gold, he says, Tapaniyam Jeshtham Suvarnam Suragam Samas Samasi Sati Krantam Pakapatrakam Saindha Vikayojvalitam Neela Pita Shweta Harita Shukapatra Varnanam Prakritir Bhavati. I repeat the last line. Neela, Pita, Shweta, Harita, Shukapatra Varnanam Prakritir Bhavati. So, pure and glittering gold is Tapaniya. Tapaniyam, Jeshtham, Suvarnam. So, the topmost quality of the gold after all the processing is called the Tapaniya. So, here again, I wish to digress and go back to the Thirrukural, which also has got perhaps the mention of the the gold, particularly Kural number 567. I would not like to repeat that Kural, but it says like how the gold, which is most brilliant after it has been heated in the furnace, like that a character of man will be splendid. So it compares the processed gold, Tapaniya gold, with the blemishless character of man. So it's interestingly exactly similar words are being used here to refer to this most pure form of gold, which is the Tapaniya gold. After you do that processing, the two-step processing, one is melting with the lead, and second, you process it, make a pakapatra, and then you add the saindhava. You do the solid state reaction after that. What you get is blue, red, white, yellow, and parrot wing color. Shukapatra Varnana. Okay. So here Shukapatra is the wing of the parrot. And if you recollect a few minutes back, while I was talking about the gold mentioned in the Sangam literature in the around the Valluvar's time, you had one term for gold which is Kilichirai. Kilichirai. Shukapatra is the exact translation of that. Gold resembling the wing of a parrot. Okay, so this I mean, I do not know what more evidence we need to highlight the one overarching combining factor of the intellectual tradition of our past, much to the chagrin and disappointment to those who harbor the separatist argument, citing one, polarizing one or pitting one against the other. Tishnam cha asya mayuragrivaabham Shvetabhangam Chimichimiyatam Pitachurnitam Kakanikah Suvarna Ragaha. So here it talks about having processed the gold, how to impart color to this processed gold. So it says the coloring ingredient of gold is one kakani of Tikshna, Vanga, and Bhujanga are again different types of metals. And if we look at the metallurgical text of different eras, the word Tikshna has attained different meaning. I'll not get into those etymological aspects, but for the time being, we can take Tikshna as one of the base metals. Kakanikah Suvarna Ragaha. So one kakani here is again a measure of weight. And like a self-consistent text, one of the Adhikarana of Arthashastra, he enumerates all these units. What is Masha, what is Kakani, and then wherever these are used in this place, he categorically says that okay, now this the details about the weight of these will be discussed in that chapter, in this chapter, like how we cross refer to. So similar kind of, as I said, the Tantrayukti is what the style is being followed by this author, and Tantrayukti is indeed one of the splendid guidelines to how to write a text in a very coherent manner. So imparting color, yes, you have to add one kakani of tikshna, by which you can get the color of the neck of a peacock tinged with white and which is dazzling and full of copper. Pitapurnitam. So these are the different ways by which you can impart the color after the gold has been processed. And again, I'll tell you that later in this chapter, he ascribes different personals for each of these processes. If you want to impart a particular color to the gold, only a particular personal is responsible for that. If you want to impart the green color like of a parrot wing, only a particular uh, in today's term we can call him as a technician or an apprentice. He is what is designated for this kind of a work. So very beautifully, not just describing about the processes, purifying or formulating gold, he lays down the policies, what should be their salaries, what should be their way of appointment, how should they be inspected, when they come in, when they go out. All those details are also present in this particular Arthashastra text. Towards the end, what I would like to now highlight is that in this Adhikarana, when today, since we were discussing more on the topic of gold, we had seen few snippets about how Arthashastra deals with gold, but this Adhikarana actually begins with lots of materials, their characteristics, the way to assay them, the way to identify counterfeits are described in the first subsection of the Adhikarana. So he takes up rubies, emeralds, the Navaratnas, diamonds, pearls originating from different places, how to test the purity of each of these pearls. And having listed them, when it comes to the chapter of gold, now because we Indians in the past celebrated gold through various ornaments, and sometimes made of only uh, pure solid gold, sometimes made of hollow gold, sometimes made of strings of gold, sometimes pearls embedded in them or gems embedded in them. There are different varieties today of some of the examples of which we can see them in the temple jewelry, where the Utsavamurti is bedecked with such kind of jewels and taken out in the procession during the festival times. Especially in the South India, this is something an annual scene for every temple that we can get to witness. So, because we were celebrating in all those various kinds of making the ornaments, and here we have Kautilya who lays down categorically in a text related to protecting the kingdom. This is again in the interest of protecting the kingdom's welfare that he has laid down all these measures. And the last passing comment, I would like to close this discussion by again highlighting the discussion or the way the social scientists have uh, analyzed Arthashastra and have tried to uh, pit him against the so-called non-Brahmin way of looking at things. There are umpteen examples that shows how the common intellectual thread bound our past. As a last passing comment, uh, there are in the Hindi translation of Professor Prannath, he notes that there are around 4,000 to 5,000 words, Sanskrit words in Arthashastra itself, which are not commonly used in any other Sanskrit texts. Okay, so which have got extinct perhaps, which might have been in vogue before the period of Kautilya. Now imagine they are not four or five, or they are not 40 or 50. There are 4,000 to 5,000 new words, of which we have purely lost the meanings. And with the fact that the fact that the entire text has not come to us in one piece, what major portions of it we might have lost is something that we need to speculate. So, given that, arriving at some of the flimsy conclusions on this text based on a Marxist way of looking at our history and uh, bipartisan way of analyzing this text must actually be looked down upon, and it's not outrightly right. It's outrightly wrong to pit this text in such a way. So with this, I thank the audience and Atharva Forum for this wonderful opportunity to get some few snippets about the gold, the way it is being discussed in this text of Arthashastra by Kautilya. Namaste.